They don't react to you by accident. It starts the moment you walk in with certainty in your eyes, when your voice doesn't shake, when your silence feels louder than their noise. Something in you becomes a mirror they didn't ask to look into, and what they see is what they've been avoiding in themselves for years. That's why the shift happens. Not because you said too much, but because you stopped shrinking. Not because you attacked them, but because you stood firm in a space they thought only doubt belonged to. And suddenly, their discomfort starts wearing different masks. Mockery, criticism, distance. Anything to hide what your confidence is exposing without a single word. Confidence doesn't just exist as a feeling inside you. It moves into a room before you even speak, before you even explain yourself, before you even try to be understood. And the strange thing is, people don't always respond to your words. They respond to what your presence reveals about them. When you stand firm in who you are, when you stop negotiating your value, when you stop asking for permission to exist comfortably, something subtle but powerful happens in the minds of those around you. They begin to feel exposed, not because you attacked them, but because you didn't join them in hiding. Most people are used to a certain balance in social spaces. They are comfortable when everyone is playing small, when doubt is shared equally, when nobody is too sure of themselves. It keeps everything predictable. But the moment someone enters that space with clarity, with grounded self-belief, with a calm refusal to shrink, that balance breaks. And what breaks it is not aggression. It is certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't need validation, doesn't chase approval, doesn't panic when misunderstood. That's where the reaction begins. Not everyone can handle the reflection you unintentionally create, because your confidence starts to highlight what they have been avoiding in themselves, the things they delayed, the risks they didn't take, the voice they suppressed, the decisions they kept postponing. And instead of facing that discomfort directly, the mind looks for an escape. It tries to shift the focus outward. It tries to label you as too much, arrogant, different, or unrealistic, because it is easier than admitting internal hesitation. This is not always conscious. People don't sit and calculate it. It happens in microseconds, in emotional reflexes. A confident person speaks, and suddenly someone feels smaller without knowing why. That feeling demands explanation, and the explanation rarely turns inward. It gets projected outward. That projection becomes reaction, and that reaction becomes behavior. Coldness, sarcasm, resistance, unnecessary criticism. What makes confidence powerful is not that it dominates others, but that it removes the illusion of comfort in insecurity. It quietly disrupts the environment that was built on mutual self-doubt. When you stop doubting yourself in a room full of doubt, you unconsciously become a contrast. And contrast is uncomfortable for those who are not ready to see it. So the reaction you face is not really about you in the way you think. It is about what you represent. You represent movement where they are stagnant. You represent decision where they are hesitation. You represent clarity where they are confusion. And the mind, when confronted with that kind of difference, often chooses defense over reflection. Even silence from a confident person carries weight because it is not empty silence. It is assured silence. It does not beg for acceptance. It does not rush to fill gaps. It does not apologize for existing. And that kind of energy can feel heavy to those who depend on external noise to validate their place in a room. The irony is that the stronger your inner stability becomes, the more visible other people's instability feels. Not because you reveal it intentionally, but because you stop hiding your own. And when hiding stops, truth becomes unavoidable in shared spaces. Confidence doesn't create insecurity in others. It simply stops covering it up. People don't always react when you become louder. They react when you stop disappearing. There is a version of you that once adjusted, softened, explained too much, apologized even when nothing was wrong, and made yourself easier for others to handle. That version kept everything smooth on the surface, but deep down it created an unspoken agreement. You shrink, they stay comfortable. And as long as that agreement is alive, things feel stable in social spaces. But the moment you stop shrinking, the entire structure starts to shake. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to challenge anyone directly. You simply exist in a more grounded version of yourself. You speak a little clearer, you hesitate less, you stop over-explaining your choices. You stop waiting for approval before you move. And strangely, that shift creates tension where there used to be ease, because many people are not reacting to your confidence alone. They are reacting to the fact that they can no longer predict you. When you were shrinking, you were predictable. Your responses were safe. Your silence was familiar. Your agreement was easy to assume. But when you stop shrinking, you introduce uncertainty. And uncertainty makes insecure environments uncomfortable. There is a silent dependency in many interactions. People become used to your smaller version. They become comfortable with you, being the one who adjusts first, who compromises first, who stays quiet first. It creates an invisible hierarchy where your presence is accepted as long as it stays reduced. The moment you step out of that reduced version, even slightly, the reactions begin to surface. Some people won't even realize what changed. They will just feel something is different. But what changed is not your personality. It is your participation in your own limitation. You stopped agreeing to be less than what you are, just to keep things smooth. And when you remove that agreement, others feel the shift, even if they can't name it. That's when subtle resistance appears. Not always direct confrontation, but small changes in tone, slight coldness, unnecessary remarks, sudden discomfort in conversations that used to flow easily. It is not about what you did differently in a loud way. It is about what you stopped doing quietly. You stopped shrinking to maintain balance that was never balanced in the first place. The mind of others starts adjusting to the new version of you, and adjustment is not always smooth, especially for those who benefited from your smaller presence, because your shrinking may have made them feel bigger without effort. It may have made them feel more certain, more in control, more stable. Now that advantage feels threatened, not because you took anything away, but because you stopped giving it unconsciously. And here is where misunderstanding grows. Your refusal to shrink gets interpreted in many distorted ways. Confidence becomes arrogance in their perception. Self-respect becomes attitude. Clarity becomes stubbornness. Not because those things are true, but because labeling you becomes easier than recalibrating how they relate to you. What they are actually reacting to is not your behavior in isolation, but the absence of your self-reduction, the silence you no longer fill with unnecessary apologies, the decisions you no longer dilute with over-explanations, the boundaries you no longer blur just to keep harmony intact. Stopping shrinking is not about becoming aggressive or dominant. It is about removing the constant negotiation with your own worth. It is about no longer adjusting your presence to fit into spaces that were only comfortable when you were smaller. And once that adjustment is gone, every interaction starts to reveal what was always there underneath the surface dynamics. Silence is often misunderstood. People assume it means emptiness, weakness, absence of response. But there is a kind of silence that is not empty at all. It is controlled, aware, and fully present. It doesn't come from confusion. It comes from certainty. And that kind of silence has a weight that loud words can never carry. It doesn't beg to be noticed, yet it dominates the space it exists in without trying. When a person becomes confident, their silence changes. It stops being a gap and starts becoming a statement. They no longer rush to fill every pause in a conversation. They no longer feel the need to explain every thought just to be understood. They no longer treat silence as something uncomfortable that must be avoided. Instead, they allow it to exist naturally, and in doing so, they shift the entire energy of interaction. This is where reactions begin to form in others. Because most people are used to noise being control. They are used to the idea that the one who speaks more holds the space. But silence with certainty breaks that assumption. It shows that control does not always need volume. It shows that presence does not always need explanation. There is something unsettling for insecure minds when they face a person who does not rush to defend themselves, when accusations don't immediately trigger over explanations, when questions are met with calm pauses instead of anxious justification. That stillness feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity often gets misread as superiority or distance. The truth is, silence becomes powerful when it is no longer driven by fear. Most people speak to avoid judgment, to fill awkwardness, to protect themselves from being misunderstood. But when confidence grows, speech becomes intentional instead of reactive. Words are no longer used as shields, and silence is no longer seen as a threat. In that state, even your pauses start to communicate something. They communicate that you are not dependent on constant validation. They communicate that you are not afraid of being misunderstood. They communicate that you are comfortable existing without immediate approval from others. And for those who rely heavily on external reassurance, that kind of energy feels disruptive. This is why people sometimes react more to your silence than your speech. Because speech can be analyzed, debated, and countered. Silence cannot be easily controlled. It forces others to sit with their own interpretation. It creates space for projection, and projection often reveals more about the observer than the person being observed. When you stop over explaining, people who were used to your justification begin to feel a shift. They are no longer receiving the emotional labor they depended on. They are no longer being guided through your thoughts step by step. Instead, they are left with clarity that does not bend itself to be more digestible for their comfort. That clarity can feel sharp to those who expect softness as a default, not because it is harsh, but because it is unfiltered. And unfiltered presence is rare in environments where people are constantly adjusting themselves to avoid discomfort. Silence also removes manipulation from the equation. When you are constantly explaining, you leave room for your words to be twisted, rearranged, reinterpreted. But when you choose silence with awareness, you reduce that vulnerability. You no longer give unnecessary access to your internal reasoning. You allow your actions to stand without justification. And this is where perception begins to shift. Some will interpret your silence as arrogance, some as emotional distance, some as unpredictability. But in reality, it is none of those things. It is simply a state where your internal world is no longer outsourced through constant explanation. Silence with certainty does not need to prove its meaning. It simply exists, and in its existence, it exposes how much noise others depend on to feel secure in themselves. Criticism is rarely just about what is being said on the surface. Most of the time, it carries something deeper underneath it, something unspoken, something uncomfortable. When people criticize, they often believe they are pointing out flaws in others, but in many cases, they know you're revealing fragments of their own internal struggle. What looks like judgment is often a reflection, and what feels like attack is sometimes just projection in disguise. When someone carries insecurity within them, they become highly sensitive to anything that challenges their internal balance. A confident presence, a decisive voice, a calm refusal to seek approval, these things can quietly disturb that balance. And instead of sitting with that discomfort and understanding it, The mind looks for a way to externalize it. It finds a target. It finds language. It finds justification. That is where criticism begins to form its shape. The interesting part is how quickly perception can shift in these moments. A neutral action becomes labeled. A simple boundary becomes attitude. A clear decision becomes ego. A calm silence becomes rude. The actual behavior doesn't always change, but the interpretation changes based on what the observer is carrying internally. In that way, criticism often says more about the speaker than the subject. People who are secure within themselves tend to observe more than they react. They don't feel the need to constantly evaluate others through a lens of comparison or discomfort. But those who are still wrestling with their own insecurities often use criticism as a way to stabilize themselves. By pointing out flaws in someone else, they temporarily reduce the pressure they feel about their own uncertainties. This is why criticism can feel so inconsistent. One person sees strength, another sees arrogance. One person sees confidence, another sees threat. The difference is not always in the behavior being observed, but in the emotional state of the observer. The same presence can trigger admiration in one mind and resistance in another. There is also a hidden layer of defense in criticism. When someone feels internally challenged by another person's growth, confidence, or clarity, they may not consciously recognize that feeling as insecurity. Instead, the mind converts it into judgment. It becomes easier to say, "They are wrong," than to say, "This makes me feel uncertain about myself." That internal translation happens so fast that most people don't even realize it is happening over time. This pattern becomes automatic. Instead of reflecting inward, the reaction goes outward. Instead of questioning personal discomfort, the focus shifts to correcting others. It becomes a habit of external evaluation, where the mind is constantly scanning for reasons to explain its own internal imbalance. But what is often missed is that criticism does not reduce insecurity. It only covers it temporarily. The discomfort returns because the source was never addressed. The act of pointing outward does not resolve what exists inwardly. It only delays the confrontation with it. When a confident person continues to exist without bending under criticism, it often intensifies the reaction in others. Not because the confident person is doing anything new, but because they are not responding in the expected way. They are not shrinking. They are not apologizing for their presence. They are not adjusting their identity to make others more comfortable. And that lack of adjustment forces others to sit with their own emotional responses more directly. Criticism, in that sense, becomes less about correction and more about discomfort management. It becomes a tool to regain a sense of control when internal balance feels disturbed. And the stronger the presence that triggers it, the more visible that underlying imbalance becomes What appears as judgment on the outside is often just an echo of something unresolved on the inside. Every person carries a private timeline inside them, a silent record of what they delayed, what they avoided, what they were afraid to attempt. And when they encounter someone who has stepped into their own direction with clarity, that contrast becomes difficult to ignore. It is not always admiration first. Sometimes it is discomfort. Sometimes it is resistance. Because presence has a way of exposing absence, and movement has a way of revealing stagnation. When you stand in your confidence, you are not just showing who you are now, you are also unintentionally reflecting what others have not yet done. Your decisions become reminders of their hesitation. Your discipline becomes a mirror of their inconsistency. Your courage becomes a quiet reference point for their fear. And that reflection is not always easy for people to sit with. Most people don't openly acknowledge what they postpone in their lives. They create space around it, excuses around it, narratives around it. It becomes easier to explain delay than to confront it. But when they see someone acting without that delay, moving without constant overthinking, choosing without constant fear, it disrupts the internal story they have built to justify their pause. That disruption often translates into emotional reaction. Not always direct, not always obvious, but subtle shifts in behavior, a change in tone, a sudden distance, an unnecessary comparison, a quiet attempt to minimize what is clearly visible. Because when someone else's action highlights your inaction, the mind naturally tries to protect its comfort zone. Your presence becomes a timeline they can measure themselves against, even if they never admit it. And in that comparison, discomfort grows. Not because you are superior, but because you are active in areas where they are still suspended in thought. You are executing where they are still imagining. You are building where they are still planning. You are moving where they are still explaining. This is where reactions start forming in environments that were previously calm. It is not always hostility. Sometimes it is sarcasm. Sometimes it is doubt disguised as advice. Sometimes it is subtle discouragement wrapped in concern. These responses often appear reasonable on the surface, but underneath, they carry the weight of internal reflection that has not been processed fully. The mind resists being reminded of its own delay, so it shifts attention outward. It focuses on flaws in execution rather than the absence of execution in itself. It focuses on imperfections in your movement rather than the fact that you are moving. Because as long as attention stays on your details, it doesn't have to sit with internal stagnation, but your confidence continues to function regardless of that reaction. It does not pause to match other people's timing. It does not slow down to reduce discomfort. It does not adjust its pace to make comparison easier for others. It simply continues, and in doing so, it keeps exposing the difference between intention and action. What makes this dynamic powerful is not confrontation, but contrast. You don't need to point anything out. Your existence in motion does that automatically. It shows that waiting is a choice, not a limitation. It shows that hesitation is not permanent, only practiced. It shows that delay is not identity, only habit. And as long as that contrast exists, reactions will continue to surface. Not because you are provoking them, but because you are no longer matching the stillness that others are used to seeing reflected back at them. When self-belief becomes stable inside a person, it stops asking permission from the environment around it. It no longer waits for agreement before it moves. It no longer depends on validation before it speaks. It no longer adjusts its direction just to reduce discomfort in others. And that kind of internal stability creates a shift that is immediately felt, even if it is not immediately understood. Most environments are quietly shaped by collective insecurity. People unconsciously agree on limits. They agree on what is too much, what is too confident, what is too different. These unspoken rules keep everything predictable. Everyone knows how to behave in a way that doesn't disturb the balance. But when someone stops following those invisible rules, the balance starts to feel unstable. Strong self-belief does not need to announce itself. It does not need to dominate conversations or force attention. It simply changes how a person carries themselves. The decisions become faster. The hesitation becomes smaller. The silence becomes more controlled. The presence becomes more grounded. And that shift alone is enough to disrupt spaces that rely on shared doubt to feel comfortable. People often underestimate how sensitive social environments are to confidence. Not loud confidence, but quiet confidence. The kind that does not explain itself repeatedly. The kind that does not apologize for existing. The kind that does not soften every boundary just to avoid tension. That kind of presence forces others to adjust because it no longer participates in the usual patterns of uncertainty. When strong self-belief enters a space, it highlights contrast. And contrast is what creates discomfort in insecure environments. Suddenly, behaviors that were once normalized start to feel exposed. Over-explaining starts to feel unnecessary. Hesitation starts to feel visible. Dependence on approval starts to feel obvious. Not because anything changed in others, but because one person stopped mirroring it back. That's why reactions often appear without clear triggers. A confident presence does not always do something specific to provoke them. It simply stops reinforcing the fragile balance that was previously maintained. And when that reinforcement disappears, people start to notice their own internal gaps more clearly. Some respond by trying to reestablish control through subtle resistance. Others respond by creating distance. Some respond through judgment, some through silence, some through indirect comparison. But underneath all these variations, the core response is the same: discomfort with a presence that no longer adjusts itself to make others feel more secure, strong. Self-belief also changes the way authority is perceived. It does not wait to be given importance. It carries importance through consistency, and that can feel unsettling to those who rely heavily on external validation to define their own position. Because when someone else no longer seeks approval, it quietly exposes how much others depend on it over time. This creates a new dynamic in every interaction. The confident person is no longer operating from negotiation, but from direction. They are no longer asking, they are choosing. They are no longer adjusting their identity for acceptance. They are expressing it without dilution. And that shift removes the comfort of predictability for those who were used to seeing them in a smaller form, even without confrontation. Strong self-belief reshapes perception. It forces environments to respond instead of remain neutral. It turns passive dynamics into active awareness. It makes invisible patterns visible without saying a word. And in that visibility, people begin to feel what they previously did not have to acknowledge. The disruption does not come from aggression or dominance, but from consistency, from not stepping back into smaller versions, from not re-entering old patterns just to restore comfort, from continuing forward even when the space around reacts to that movement.